Once upon a time, a very long time ago, there lived a man named Antonio Stradivari. Stradivari was an extraordinary violin maker. He conjured magical musical instruments out of the most ordinary blocks of wood. Their tone was like a nightingale's song, pure and strong and sweet. Other craftsmen grew curious. What made Stradivari's violins so special? But try as they might, no one could discover his secret. And the cunning Stradivari told nobody, carrying it with him to his grave.
It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But the amazing thing is that it's all true. Ever since I started learning the violin as a child, the name Stradivarius has held an almost mythical appeal. In the 17th century, Antonio Stradivari made over 1,000 instruments, and about 600 of them still survive. But a Strad is so much more than just a musical instrument. Each one is like a little miracle in wood, and for violinists, they're the ultimate holy grail. The prospect of playing one, let alone owning one, is an almost unimaginably thrilling prospect. For me, though, part of the enchantment lies in the fact that 250 years after his death, we still don't know how he did it. We still have never really discovered Stradivari's secret.
Although I stopped playing the violin seriously in my teens, I've remained a bit of a violin geek. So this summer's exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford is a rare treat. For the first time ever in Britain, it brings together 21 of Stradivari's finest instruments from museums and private collections all around the world. Every single one has an incredibly rich history, but I've singled out some of my favourites. This is the story of Stradivarius, told through 4 very special violins. We'll never know when or where the very first violin was made. The fiddle seems to have appeared fully formed during the 16th century. For me, the Stradivari story really begins in the 1560s, 80 years before his birth, when his hometown of Cremona in northern Italy became the violin-making capital of Europe. The earliest violins were an accompaniment to lively nights in the tavern.
But in more refined circles, the fiddle was frowned upon. It might be an appropriate plaything for a peasant, but it was hardly deemed appropriate for courtly entertainment or religious services. In parts of Italy, the church even ordered the destruction of this supposedly licentious object.
But something happened to change the fortunes of the violin and Cremona forever. This curious new instrument entranced Catherine de' Medici, one of the most powerful women in Renaissance Europe. Captivated by its unique sound, she ordered a set of 38 new violins from Italy.
And they were all made in Cremona by Antonio Stradivari's forefather, Andrea Amati, the very first master violin maker in history.
This violin was one of the instruments that Amati made for Catherine de' Medici in 1564. It's the oldest surviving violin in the world.
I didn't think I'd feel quite so emotional holding it. What is just mind-boggling is that this doesn't look like a first draft. This doesn't look like some rough and ready prototype. This is what it is. This is a violin. It's very light.
slightly smaller than a modern instrument, but...
This early violin was made, like all those that followed it, out of maple wood. Its form is beautiful, but it's functional too. The curves equalise the resonance at all frequencies, where a simpler shape would favour one note over others. The first piece of music written for the violin, composed by Catherine de' Medici's court musician, may well have been played on this very instrument.
I feel like music's one of those things that connects us all through time and through history. And it's so ephemeral. You know, we hear it, it's just molecules and vibrations in the air, but to actually hold the object that would have played the first piece of violin music ever written. It's just completely bewilderingly wonderful.
Andrea Amati and his family dominated violin making for the next 100 years. But in the middle of the 17th century, a young Cremonese craftsman emerged who would go on to challenge the Amati's crown. His name was Antonio Stradivari, and his oldest fiddle is here in the Ashmolean Museum.
One of the things that really adds to the allure of Stradivari is that he seems to come out of nowhere. We know very little about his birth or his childhood. It's almost as if he arrives with this. This is his first known violin, and it's known as the Serde. It was made in 1666, which is the same year as the Great Fire of London. We do know from later records that Stradivari was about 22 when he produced it. I have been waiting for this moment for pretty much my entire life, it feels like, because I'm actually going to be allowed to hold this Strad and even to play it. This is the first time in my life that I've ever held a Strad. It's just something that as a violinist you grow up dreaming about. Never, ever, ever imagine that you'll be able to actually do it.
A few things about the Serde suggest it's the work of a novice. The slightly awkward arching of the back and the irregular details on the corners. But it also has features that would become Stradivari's trademarks, like the sound holes and the scroll.
One of the really interesting things about this violin is the label, which reads Antonius Stradivarius Cremonensis alumnus Nicolai Amati faciebat anno 1666, which suggests that perhaps Stradivarius really was a pupil of Amati. If so, it's the only shred of evidence that we have that he was, if indeed it is evidence. I do wonder if he did study with Amati, or whether it was just a great career move to suggest that he did.
It's tantalising to think about the music that might have been played on the Serde by its very first owner. Stradivari was a contemporary of the great Johann Sebastian Bach, so I'd like to think that it might have been one of my favourite pieces, Bach's Concerto for Two Violins in D minor. I've asked Jennifer Pike, who I met through the Young Musician of the Year competition, which she won aged just 12, to come and help me put the Serde through its paces.
Do you ever lose, does it ever get less thrilling to play a Strad?
I don't think so, no. That kind of feeling of awe never leaves you.
It feels fitting to play Bach on a Strad, I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
Shall we have a go?
Let's have a go.
Jennifer's playing a Strad from the exhibition, and I've been allowed to play the Serde, Stradivari's earliest violin.
Nice. The tone really is unbelievable. What do you think, because you obviously play on an amazing violin all the time, but what makes the tone different? What makes it so special?
I don't know, each violin has its own voice in a way. This is really mellow, it's just, it's so warm, it's like sitting by the fire.
It's like an old friend.
Yeah, it is like an old friend.
Even though we just met. I don't think I ever really want to give it back either. You don't mind, Ashmolean, if we never give them back, do you?
The year after Stradivari made the Surde violin, he married a local girl, and their first child was born a slightly unorthodox 4 months later. He was now a contented family man. But professionally, Stradivari had yet to reach the height of his powers. It was not until over a decade later that his career really took off. And I get the sense that, as well as his phenomenal technical skill, he also had a very good manner with his clients.
There's very little documentary evidence about Stradivari's life, which makes what we do have incredibly precious, like this letter I've got a copy of here. Now, my Italian is a bit rusty, but he writes, "Most illustrious and excellent sir, I didn't send the violins sooner because I was waiting for somebody trustworthy.
And I pray you to forgive me for not sending it more quickly, and I hope you will appreciate it. I remain yours.
Your very modest and devoted servant, Antonio Stradivari." And it's dated Cremona, the 23rd of August. Now, we don't know who this very illustrious and excellent sir was, but I'm extremely envious of him. Imagine getting a letter like this from Stradivari. I think you'd forgive him being late, wouldn't you?
Michael Kens has been making violins for 40 years. The methods he uses have hardly changed since Stradivari's day, and he shares my admiration for the great craftsman's skill.
As a violin maker, is it possible to say how a Strad is different from everything else?
You know it when you see it, and you know it when you hear it, obviously. I mean, they are very, very fine-sounding instruments. And the more I've been a violin maker, almost the greater he gets.
He was there in Cremona at the same time as many other makers. He was using the same wood, the same varnish, the same mortar, the same materials, and yet his violins are so different. How is it possible to explain that?
I think Stradivari, in a sense, maybe was the right man at the right time. He he grew out of 3 generations in Cremona of fine makers, and he just took it that several stages further and had a long working life and really was, hugely talented. It's maybe a little bit like Rembrandt. They all had the same paints, they all had the same canvases, but Rembrandt had something special, and there's a little bit of that when it comes to talking about Stradivari.
Is it fair to say that he's a genius?
I think so. There's just something special. He has more, there's a few more gears when you start looking at it.
Looking at a Strad, are you intimidated? Are you inspired? How do you feel?
I think I am inspired. It's huge. It's huge. It's intimidating as well, because it reflects on your own limitations. But nevertheless, you have to stand up to the block and have a shot at it, and that's the fun of it.
Stradivari was producing violins during a golden age of music for the instrument. The great Baroque composers like Bach and Corelli were at their height, and their compositions demanded a level of virtuosity that a previous generation of players could only have dreamt of. At the same time, venues were getting larger, and for a violin to reach the very back rows, it needed a much more powerful tone.
Stradivari rose to this challenge and set out to create the perfect instrument.
During a decade of constant experimentation, he produced fiddles in different shapes and sizes, including this, the long Strad, before returning to his tried and tested design. Although in his 60s, Stradivari was about to surpass himself as a craftsman. The violins he produced during his golden period, at the beginning of the 18th century, are still the most highly prized in the world. And the Viotti is one of them. Named after the brilliant 18th century virtuoso Giovanni Battista Viotti, who once owned it, this Strad has recently been valued at £3.5 million. But we've been given very special permission to play it. Handsome, elegant and charming, Viotti was a natural performer. It's rumoured that he received the Strad as a love token from Catherine the Great. But although he was the darling of audiences back home in Italy, there was one crowd who were notoriously hard to impress.
There's a great story of how Viotti seduced 18th century Paris, a place that was famous not only for its suspicion of Italian musicians, but also of the violin as a solo instrument. One French writer went so far as to publish a defence of the bass viol against the ventures of the violin, describing it as an undersized pygmy.
But if anyone could change their mind, it was Viotti. And it's perhaps a sign of his self-assurance that his Parisian premiere was no low-key affair.
Viotti's French debut was booked for Good Friday, one of the biggest nights of the concert calendar. It took place at the Concert Spirituel, one of the most prestigious venues in the city. You can only imagine the atmosphere as he raised his bow.
At first, the audience was sceptical. But by the end of the concert run, Paris was seduced by the way Viotti's violin sang, like a human voice.
This string of concerts would change the course of violin playing forever, not just in Paris, but throughout Europe. As leading musicians sought to emulate Viotti's remarkable tone, the Stradivarius became the instrument of choice for soloists the world over.
Stradivari died in December 1737, aged 92. He'd been making violins for over 70 years. And the saying, as rich as Stradivari, was common on the streets of Cremona.
But even after his death, Stradivari's reputation continued to grow as his instruments took on a life of their own.
In 1890, the Strad, a journal dedicated to string instruments, issued its very first publication. The editorial observed that since Stradivari's death, violin making had practically come to a standstill.
It touched on something that was beginning to puzzle the public. Just what was it about Stradivari's violins that made them so special? The search was on to try and uncover his secret.
Many theories have been suggested over the years. Was Stradivari using wood that had been soaked in seawater or covered in volcanic ash? Was his an unusually dense crop of maple? Or was there a secret formula to the legendary Cremonese varnish?
But so far, there's been no definitive answer. Despite our best efforts, science is yet to solve the riddle of what set Stradivari apart. And I wonder whether there really is a magic formula, or whether he wasn't just astonishingly good at what he did, a kind of Shakespeare or Titian whose genius can never, ever be slavishly copied or repeated.
And if there's one violin that embodies the way Stradivari's craft has obsessed generation after generation, it's the Messiah. Made during his golden period in 1716, Stradivari never parted with this particular fiddle. It remained in his workshop until the day he died. Each of its successive owners has fallen under its spell. Many only parted with it on death.
What would I do to have you in my life? What wouldn't I do to have you in my life?
And the Messiah remains as flawless as the day it was finished, because this Strad has hardly ever been played. Even being able to handle it is an incredible privilege.
There's no other instrument in the world that has such mythical status as this, despite its solidity and its presence in my hands right now. And I suppose, the proviso of the Ashmolean having this instrument was that it was never played and that it remains pristine and perfect. And in a sense, that just perpetuates the myth that no one would part with it till they die, and the fact that we can't hear it sing, we can't hear its voice. We can only imagine and dream and wonder what it might actually sound like. But my hunch is that it would sound pretty good.
The Messiah captured the public's imagination, just as enthusiastic Victorian amateurs were beginning to take up the violin in droves. This created a lucrative market for affordable, mass-produced new instruments. For this, they needed a template, and the Messiah, the pristine, perfect Strad, was the obvious choice. It became the most copied violin in the world.
One of the special things about a Strad is their rich histories. This is just a box of silent wood hanging here, and yet you can almost feel it resonating, echoing with all the magnificent performances that it must have given over the centuries.
There's one concert at which I'd have loved a front row seat. It took place on the 14th of June 1921 at the Queen's Hall in London. It was the orchestral premiere of one of the most mesmerising pieces ever written for the violin. The soloist was Marie Hall, and the Strad she cradled had previously been owned by Viotti.
Marie Hall's career is a real-life Cinderella story. She was a girl from an ordinary working-class background who came to the attention of Vaughan Williams whilst playing the violin on a street corner.
Vaughan Williams had composed the Lark Ascending with Marie and her Stradivarius in mind. The combination of a spellbinding piece written by a British composer, played by an English rose, captivated the interwar audience. Marie Hall and her Strad became one of the most iconic musical pairings of the era. They toured the world, playing to packed-out concert halls together. She called the violin her greatest treasure. It's easy to understand why Marie Hall became so attached to her Stradivarius. To hear these instruments played and to have the opportunity to play a Strad myself has been an unbelievable pleasure and a privilege. When you hold a Stradivarius, it's so much more than just a musical instrument. It's like a slice of history, a treasure, and a responsibility. Even the very greatest musicians don't actually own them. They're just custodians of the instrument during a particular chapter of its history, a history that stretches across continents and centuries. I'm still enthralled by this mystery, and by the fact that the answer to what makes a Strad seems to be as elusive to us as why do we fall in love? It's like the ultimate riddle, a perennial quest, and a humbling reminder that for all of our modern technology and scientific advances, we still don't have all the answers.
Love is like a violin with its strings around your heart, soft and sweet as dreams begin.